Welcome back to the NGSS virtual crash course. You're now in Module 2, which is meant to create literacy around NGSS so that you can unpack those performance expectations and make meaning of them in your classroom. In this module, you'll learn how to unpack the performance expectations, you'll make meaning of what the DCIs, the SEPs, and the CCCs look like, and you'll also find relevant phenomena for your units. So today we're going to be working on Module 2.1, which is Unpacking NGSS Performance Expectations. Keep in mind the norm for our course. This is the same norm that we went over in 1.1, which is a commitment to unlearning. I'll be sharing with you a little bit about what that looked like for me. And our learning objective for this module specifically is being able to unpack the 3 dimensions of an NGSS performance expectation. When we say 3 dimensions, just a quick review from Module 1, those 3 dimensions are the disciplinary core idea, which is often known as the content, the cross-cutting concept, which we call the CCC, and the SEP, the science and engineering practices. In Module 2, Lesson 2, Heather will be going over more about what each of those means in your instruction and in your assessment. To accomplish this, what you'll be doing today is you're already watching this introductory video on 2.1. You'll be using the NGSS website in conjunction with the scavenger hunt. You're going to try to unpack those performance expectations and find important items on the NGSS website pertaining to your standards or performance expectations. And then you'll watch a short video on how to read those performance expectations. The 4th step in this lesson is to dive a little bit deeper into the CCCs and SEPs. We know that most teachers are used to teaching and creating assessments with content, but the CCCs and the SEPs are often left behind. So you'll take a little bit more time to learn about those today and understand what that looks like in your grade levels and content areas. Finally, you'll finish up this lesson by doing a short reflection on the Padlet. So when we get down into the level of instruction and assessment of the next generation science standards, we start to talk about performance expectations. Performance expectations have an individual code that tells you the grade level, the domain, and other information about what the students are expected to perform. Unlike many other standards, the 3 dimensions come out in your NGSS performance expectations. It tells you how the student is expected to perform on the science or engineering practice, the cross-cutting concept, and the disciplinary core idea. Now, we know that NGSS came later in the game than many other science standards. I mentioned in 1.1 that they came out in 2013, and it had been almost 30 years since someone had revised standards at the national or international level. So what tended to happen, and what still happens in many cases, is that when teachers are in schools where NGSS has been adopted, they receive little to no professional learning, and what they're able to recognize in those performance expectations is the content, which is contained in the disciplinary core ideas. So in most classrooms of schools where NGSS has been adopted, you do see that the content focus is aligned with the DCIs and the performance expectations. But what you may see omitted are those science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts. It is also possible that because some of the science and engineering practices are grounded in an understanding of the nature of science or parts of the scientific method, that is something that translates into teacher practice more easily than the CCCs. So today we're actually going to focus a bit more on the CCCs because they tend to be so easily overlooked. So today I'm going to share a little bit of information about my NGSS journey. This is a snapshot of my first year as a science teacher, which was 2009. So that year, my state, Arizona, paid a $12 million contract to Pearson to use a standardized testing instrument that included science, and they started to produce these report cards showing how far above or behind other states Arizona was. The first science standards that I worked with looked something like this, where it's a list, it's mainly a content list, and the verb that you'll see before each thing is knows, 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 knows. So this immediately primed me to think that my job was to make sure that students knew all the things about science, and often the tools that I relied on for that were my worksheets, my textbooks, and the things that were assuring that my students were learning all of this content. I'll admit, I love science content. I love nerding out on science. I love learning new things. I can spend hours reading about it, watching documentaries, learning through articles, but often that's about science that has already been constructed by other people. So I really didn't know what to expect the first time that I saw the NGSS performance expectations. And it's not because I was a resistant teacher or because I wasn't well-meaning. I definitely cared about science and cared about student learning, but me, and like many of you, I was dealing with prepackaged standards that came out of a different time in thinking about science. So in the 80s, the last time that the science standards were really updated, there were reports published about how the United States education system was at risk, and standards were developed as one of the goals in response to that report and that work by the administrations in the 80s. So what those lists contained were tons of things that students were expected to know in order to essentially play catch-up. Lots of things came out of this era in education, including teacher appraisal and evaluation, longer school days, and more instructional minutes. So if you've ever looked at your standards and you felt like you're running a race, that may be why it feels that way. And changing to NGSS doesn't take that feeling away that you need to get through a certain amount of performance expectations in your scope and sequence. But for me, what it did is it stopped that race from being about content coverage, and it turned it into how can I get as deep as possible in constructing learning for my students while also paying attention to how they're thinking, what they're doing, and what they know. This is an image that I used in 1.1 to kind of show what this progression looks like for a middle school standard. If you're still racing through that content, then your assessments may look something like this. If you're paying attention to the skill, developing and using a model, then you might be over here eating some delicious cell cakes. And if you are really looking at structure and function, the cross-cutting concept, and really the transversal part of NGSS, then you might have an assessment that looks more like this. So let's get started on what you'll be doing today. You're going to be using a scavenger hunt with 9 items to explore your performance expectations on the NGSS website. So as you enter the main site, you can use the quick search. The main thing you should do is put in your grade band or your grade level. And if you teach a particular content area, you might want to find something related to a unit. Something in these PSs would be physical science, LS would be life sciences, and earth and space sciences would be ESS. The ETS are your design and engineering standards. So go ahead and click on one of those, and that will launch you into a page that has all the different performance expectations for what you set in that search. So here's what the page looks like that we'd like you to do the scavenger hunt on. It should have one performance expectation here. It should have your PE, some red text, 3 colored boxes, and some information down here, and a right side panel. This is much easier to use than the PDFs that are produced on some parts of the website, because these have scrollable features where as you roll over your performance expectation, you can get some additional information about what you're working with. So do your best to find these scavenger hunt items on a performance expectation from the website. And then what you'll do next is use this great video that shows how to read the next generation science standards, and that should help you identify anything from this scavenger hunt that may have been challenging to find. The second to last item is to explore one of my favorite sites. This is Paul and Laura Anderson's Wonder of Science. This will really help grow your understanding of the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts so they do not become the forgotten about parts of your performance expectations. Using the links provided, you're going to enter one of the CCCs or the SEPs, and you're going to search for your grade level to find a learning progression that tells you a little bit about what that cross-cutting concept, in this case I'm looking at patterns, what patterns looks like as a way of thinking about science in grades 6 through 8, for example, if I'm a middle school teacher. So you'll use a little bit of your time today to explore cross-cutting concepts. You'll also do that for the science and engineering practices. And then you'll choose one mini lesson from Paul Anderson to watch a little bit of modeling. So as you go through these links, this is under development. I just spoke with Paul and he's going to be working on them and continuing to upload more. So you may not be able to find mini lessons for all of the CCCs and the SEPs, but if you click on, for example, patterns, you'll find different levels of depth for that cross-cutting concept, and you'll get to see him model a lesson about observational patterns, for example. You'll spend the bulk of your time exploring those Wonder of Science SEP and CCC resources, and when you finish that up, your reflection on the Padlet will be to think about how NGSS performance expectations are similar to or different from other science standards or resources that you have used in the past. Enjoy your learning today and happy NGSSing.